大家好，欢迎来到我们的六度解析节目。今天我们要挑战性地探讨一个火热的社会话题，中国国家主席习近平对银行家的不满以及背后的原因。这篇文章由 Shulai Ren 撰写，他是彭博社的一位专栏作家，专门报道亚洲市场。习近平对金融业的怀疑态度并非无根无据，他的反贪腐机构再次开始对大型银行和金融监管机构进行新一轮的检查，并且正在制定限制高管薪酬和更严格的追回条款。此外，新的金融监管立法也正在酝酿之中，涵盖了从股东权利到保险公司风险暴露的各个方面。这些举措看似是为了安抚公众的不满，特别是在经济增长放缓的背景下，顶尖金融专业人士的奢华生活更容易引发社会的愤慨。从习近平个人的经历来看，金融业带来的收入不平等和高管薪酬差距是他担忧的主要问题。此外，私募财富管理行业的繁荣使得经济系统更加不公平，这一点在习近平亲自叫停蚂蚁集团首次公开募股后尤为明显。这也引发了关于特权和资源分配的质疑，为什么只有少数人能够在价值连城的独角兽公司中成为早期投资者并一夜暴富？习近平的一些政策，如设立每年40万美元的税前薪酬上限，虽然引起了争议，但在西方国家也能找到共鸣。例如，瑞士政府就对瑞银集团的高管薪酬提出了质疑，要求更严格的资本要求。这些共同的情感和政策反映了不同的政治系统之间的相似点。习近平的强硬手段正是他能够采取的方式，试图在问题失控之前解决这些社会热点问题。请大家继续收看详细内容。大家好，欢迎收看今天的特别节目，我是您的主持人。今天我们将探讨一篇来自彭博社的深度报道，作者是 Shulai Ren， 他是一名专栏作家，曾是一名投资银行家，并且拥有 CFA 认证。这篇文章标题为习对于银行家无感，他有自己的理由，发表时间是2024年7月23日下午3点。文章首先指出，中国国家主席习近平对银行家持谨慎态度，尤其对他们在社会中的价值存疑。为了应对金融界的腐败问题，国家反腐败机构正在对大型金融机构和监管机构进行新的审查，这仅仅是3年前的另一次大规模检查之后的举措。此外，国有金融机构正在制定薪酬上限和更严格的追回条款，新的立法也在进行中，涵盖了从股东权利到保险公司风险暴露等各方面的金融监管。这一系列措施无疑带有一定的民粹色彩。随着经济放缓，金融高管奢侈的生活方式容易引发公众的不满。站在习的角度，他对金融行业的体验并不尽如人意。高管与普通员工之间巨大的薪酬差距，以及金融在加剧财富不平等方面的作用，都令他感到担忧。例如，明星共同基金经理因为他们的筹资能力而获得高额报酬，这主要是因为他们的网技可以吸引新投资者。然而，真正的疑问在于这些经理的内在价值到底有多大？去年，量化基金表现出色，市场平均回报率为 6.4%。然而，随着今年2月量化地震的发生，一些高调的基金遭遇了巨大损失，引发了更广泛的市场动荡。许多基金面临过度暴露于交易量低的小盘股的风险，当局不得不花费57亿美元来稳定股票市场。显然，习在农历新年期间并没有度过一个安稳的假期。习近平还可能担心公众对私募财富管理行业日益繁荣导致的经济不公平现象越来越不耐烦。一项有趣的学术调查发现，20年前，人们认为能力和教育是致富的主要原因，因此对不平等现象抱有宽容态度。然而，现在最重要的致富因素被认为是关系和家境。这种担忧在习近平亲自叫停蚂蚁集团2020年34亿美元首次公开募股之后尤为明显。自那以后，人们对特权和机会的不平等提出了诸多质疑。例如，一对夫妇通过从瑞士信贷和一名现已入狱的银行大亨处借款，投资了蚂蚁集团创始人马云的电影项目，4个月内净赚了7500万美元。该家庭还通过持有不知名私募股权公司的股份，于2016年早期购买了蚂蚁集团的股份。换句话说，私人银行家和他们提供的廉价贷款是将数百万美元变成数十亿美元的魔法。习近平的一些政策，如实施40万美元的税前薪酬上限，引发了广泛关注， 并被归因于他的共同富裕倡议。但是坦率地说，他可以在西方找到很多同情的声音。例如，瑞士政府目前就资本要求和银行家薪酬问题与瑞银集团高管发生了公开冲突。瑞士财政部长 Karin Keller-Sutter 对首席执行官 Sergio Ermati 的1590万美元薪酬表示不解，指出他需要30年才能赚到同样的金额。更严格的资本规则可能会使瑞银集团付出150亿到250亿美元的代价，几乎肯定会导致高管薪酬的降低。这些情绪的本质是相同的，唯一的区别在于政治体系的不同。习近平在处理这些敏感的社会问题时更加强硬和果断，因为他可以。他试图在问题失控之前采取行动。深入分析这篇文章的背景和内容，我们可以看到，习近平的种种举措反映了他对金融行业的不信任和对社会公平的重视。从历史上看，中国的金融业一直被视为经济增长的关键驱动力，但同时也被认为是腐败和不公平的温床。习近平的反腐败行动和对金融监管的加强，既是为了遏制腐败，也是为了保证经济的稳定和可持续发展。从另一个角度来看，这些政策也反映了全球对金融高管薪酬和金融行业不平等问题的关注。例如，西方国家也在不断加强对金融高管薪酬的监管，试图通过各种措施来减少社会不平等。习近平的政策在某种程度上可以看作是响应这一全球趋势，但他的方式更为直接和强硬。然而，这些政策也可能带来一些负面影响。例如，过度的监管可能限制金融行业的创新和发展，导致资本外流和人才流失。此外，这些政策可能会增加金融机构的运营成本，进而影响整个经济的运行效率。因此，如何在监管和发展之间找到平衡，将是习近平和中国政府需要面对的一个重要课题。总的来说，习近平对金融行业采取的一系列措施，反映了他对社会公平和经济稳定的重视，同时也展示了他在应对复杂社会问题时的强硬态度。这些政策的实施将对中国的金融业和整个经济产生深远的影响。感谢大家今天的收看，请大家继续关注本节目的深入探索。我是您的主持人，我们下次再见。大家好，欢迎来到我们的6度解析节目。今天我们要挑战的是特朗普最近的言论，他指责台湾偷走了美国的芯片产业，这真的是事实吗？特朗普在接受彭博商业周刊采访时，声称台湾从美国手中夺走了价值5000亿美元的计算机芯片制造业，这引起了广泛关注。然而，业内专家告诉 CNN， 这根本不是事实。台湾的芯片产业是通过前瞻性努力和投资有机的发展起来的，而非偷窃。台湾机体电路制造公司 TSMC 创始人张忠谋的革命性商业模式，重塑了全球电子行业的格局，使台湾成为行业领导者。如今，台湾生产了全球超过90%的先进芯片。然而，随着台美关系的变化和特朗普的言论，这一局势未来可能会如何发展？请大家继续收看详细内容。亲爱的观众朋友们，欢迎收看今天的特别节目。今天我们要讨论的是一则来自 CNN 的新闻。这则新闻与美国前总统唐纳德·特朗普最近发表的关于台积电及台湾芯片产业的言论有关。这些言论在国际社会上引起了广泛的关注和争议。现在，让我们来详细解读这一事件的始末和背后的深层次问题。上周，特朗普在接受彭博商业周刊采访时，指责台湾偷走了美国在价值5000亿美元的计算机芯片制造产业中的王冠。这位前总统甚至强调，台湾已从美国手中夺走了几乎100%的芯片产业。这一言论一经发表，立即引发了广泛的讨论和反驳。业界专家表示，台湾并没有偷走美国的芯片产业，而是通过前瞻性努力和投资，自然发展了自身的半导体产业。让我们回溯一下台湾芯片产业的发展历程，来看看事实的真相。台湾的芯片产业崛起可以追溯到1987年，当时台湾机体电路制造公司 TSMC 由张忠谋先生创立，而张忠谋是一位在美国半导体业界工作多年的资深人士。他在55岁时创立了 TSMC， 并提出了一种全新的商业模式——纯代工厂模式，即根据客户的设计制造半导体。 这种模式在当时被认为是不可行的，因为当时的常态是企业内部同时拥有设计和制造能力。然而，张忠谋的远见改变了全球电子产业的格局，为台湾成为芯片行业的领导者奠定了基础。根据半导体行业协会的数据，台湾现在生产了全球超过 90% 的先进芯片。TSMC 通过将制造与设计分开，专注于制造环节，从而能够为多个客户服务并扩大规模。这样的规模效应使得 TSMC 能够不断改进技术，降低成本，保持在全球市场的竞争力。去年7月， TSMC 在其总部所在地新竹开设了全球研发中心，继续在技术领域进行投资。这种合同制造模式在其他行业如纺织品和消费电子产品中也已被台湾广泛使用，并且在芯片行业中特别有效。前 TSMC 研发总监康拉德·杨表示，顶级工程师相对较低的劳动成本和长工时的结合，导致了更高的生产力。同时，台湾的技术生态系统也是该岛芯片实力的关键组成部分。尽管如此，其他竞争对手如英特尔和三星电子也在积极模仿 TSMC 的成功模式。同时，美国政府也在施压台湾，希望其部分芯片研发功能转移到美国。但台湾行政院长卓荣泰表示，台湾没有计划改变其策略。他认为，台湾拥有非常好的技术人才和研发投资环境，将尖端技术的研发留在台湾是最好的选择。在采访中，特朗普还表示，台湾应该支付防御费用。他将美国的防御援助比作保险服务，认为台湾没有给予美国任何回报。这一言论在台湾引起了强烈反应，被比作要求保护费，让人们担忧，如果特朗普再次当选，他的政策可能会如何影响美台关系。台海局势的紧张给 TSMC 带来了不小的压力，要求其在台湾以外地区分散生产基地，以降低风险。在美国 COVID-19 大流行期间的芯片短缺和美中竞争的加剧，使得恢复国内芯片制造成为战略重点。2022年，美国总统拜登签署了芯片与科学法案，旨在提高国内芯片生产，减少对台湾和韩国最先进芯片的依赖。虽然目前尚不清楚特朗普如果再次当选总统会对台湾有什么具体影响，但业内人士表示，芯片公司应努力寻找更好的合作方式，以实现互利共赢的关系。对于正在亚利桑那州建设3家工厂的 TSMC 而言，找到适应当地文化的生产系统尤为重要，这样才能真正实现全球化运营。从经济角度来看，特朗普的言论无疑是以保护主义为核心，试图通过施压来促进美国本土芯片产业的发展。然而，这种说法忽视了全球化背景下的产业分工和技术转移的复杂性。台湾的成功并非一蹴而就，而是经过多年积累和发展的结果。简单的将其归因于偷走，不仅不符合事实，也不利于国际产业合作和全球经济的健康发展。从政治角度看，特朗普的言论可能更多是一种策略，为自己的竞选和政治利益服务。通过激发民众对外部威胁的关注，他试图转移国内矛盾和压力。然而，这样的言论可能会加剧国际关系的紧张，尤其是在当前美中台关系复杂敏感的局势下。在科技领域 ，TSMC 的成功也让我们看到了一种新的商业模式的可能性。这种模式不仅仅对台湾有益，也为全球科技行业提供了新的发展方向。如何在保持竞争力的同时实现国际合作，是未来科技企业需要思考的重要问题。总的来说，特朗普关于台湾芯片产业的言论引发了广泛的讨论和反思。它不仅涉及到经济、政治和科技等多个层面，也让我们更加清楚地认识到全球化背景下各国的相互依存和合作的重要性。感谢大家收看本期特别节目，我们将继续关注这一事件的发展，并为您带来更多深入的分析和报道。请大家继续收看本节目的深入探索。
请大家继续收看节目第6度百科，对关键内容进行背景介绍。唐纳德·特朗普在彭博商业周刊采访中指责台湾夺走了美国的芯片产业，这一说法引起了广泛关注。
然而，这并不符合现实。
业内专家指出，台湾的半导体产业是通过前瞻性的规划、努力和大量投资有机发展起来的，而不是从美国偷走的。 台湾半导体产业的成功可以追溯到1987年，当时张忠谋创立了台湾机体电路制造公司 TSMC。张忠谋是一位中国出生的美国人，曾在英特尔、摩托罗拉和德州仪器等公司工作。创立 TSMC 时，他提出了一个全新的商业模式，即
纯代工厂的
概念。这种模式专注于根据客户提供的设计来制造半导体，与当时行业内部同时拥有设计和制造能力的常态相反。
这种模式在当时被认为是不可能的，但最终证明了其巨大的潜力和成功。
透过这种模式 ，TSMC 可以专注于半导体制造，并且为多个不同的客户提供服务，这使得公司能够迅速扩大规模。规模经济效应使得 TSMC 能够产生更多的收入，这些收入又被投入到改进芯片生产技术和降低制造成本中。如今 TSMC 拥有世界上最先进的芯片生产技术，并计划继续在这一领域进行大量投资。根据半导体行业协会的数据，台湾现在生产了全球超过 90% 的先进芯片。除此之外，台湾在其他行业如纺织品和消费电子产品中已经成功应用了类似的合同制造模式，这使得其在半导体行业的应用更加得心应手。前 TSMC 研发总监康拉德·杨表示，台湾顶级的工程师相对较低的劳动成本和长工时的结合，导致了更高的生产力，这是台湾半导体产业的关键组成部分。
然而，这并不意味着美国及其他国家的竞争对手没有在努力追赶。
英特尔和三星电子等公司都在努力模仿 TSMC 的成功模式。
此外，美国政府也在推动重新在国内建立芯片制造能力。
2022年，总统乔·拜登签署了《芯片与科学法案》，旨在提高国内芯片生产，减少对台湾和韩国最先进芯片的依赖。目前，美国国内芯片生产仅占全球供应量的 10%。至于台湾政府，行政院长卓荣泰表示，台湾没有计划改变其策略，认为将尖端技术的研发留在台湾是最好的选择。特朗普在采访中还提到，台湾应该为其防御支付费用，这种言论在台湾引起了不满和担忧。总而言之，台湾的半导体产业成功是诸多因素共同作用的结果。这些因素包括正确的商业模式、优秀的工程师、相对低廉的劳动成本和高效的生产力等。这并不是如特朗普所言偷走了美国的产业，而是一个有机发展的过程。当前的国际和地缘政治形势下，各国都在努力提高自身的芯片制造能力，以降低对台湾的依赖。
欢迎大家进入六度探索的辩论环节。我们从正反两个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
大家好，我是楚天舒。特朗普的言论真是个天大的笑话。台湾怎么会偷走美国的芯片产业呢？这分明是台湾自己努力和智慧的成果。TSMC 的成功正是因为他们创新的商业模式和持续的技术投入。特朗普这些话说的好像当年美国的半导体产业完全没有竞争对手一样，这简直是在侮辱全球的科技进步啊！
楚天舒，你这么说可有点天真了。特朗普的话可能有些夸张，但你也不能否认美国的芯片制造业确实在逐渐落后，这和台湾超前的布局和策略有很大的关系。美国的半导体巨头们可是有些睡着了，他们没能及时应对全球市场的变化，这难道不是事实吗？
谢琪琪，请你搞清楚，技术竞争是全球化的，不是你死我活的零和游戏。台湾的 TSMC 成功的背后是张忠谋的远见卓识和台湾政府的支持，这和偷窃毫无关系。更何况，美国的英特尔和德州仪器等公司也并非完全没落，他们也在积极追赶。特朗普这样说只是为了吸引选票，并不代表事实。
楚天舒，你说的也有道理，但忽略了一个关键点：地缘政治。特朗普说台湾应该为美国的防御支付费用，这其实反映了他对于国际关系的商业化理解。 美国在保护台湾的同时，也希望能从中获得实质性的回报，这无可厚非。至于芯片产业，不管谁说了什么，现实是美国必须加大自身的投入，拜登的芯片与科学法案就是最好的例证。
谢琪琪，我们谈论的是技术和产业的发展，不该过度政治化。台湾的半导体行业能够成长壮大，是因为他们的创新能力和市场竞争力。而特朗普的言论，无非是试图把美国的产业颓势归咎于外部因素，这样只会让问题更加复杂化。而且，台湾在防御方面的问题，不能和商业利益混为一谈，这是国际关系的基本原则。
楚天舒说的好像台湾和美国真的能分得那么清楚似的。在现实世界中，经济和政治从来都是交织在一起的。特朗普可能言语夸张，但他的本质诉求是希望美国能重振自身的产业竞争力，这难道不对吗？你所谓的国际关系基本原则，在现实中往往被经济利益所左右。最后，不管怎么说，如果美国不能加大投入，真有可能永远被台湾和其他国家甩在身后。
I want to start by stepping back a bit. This is not a moment in American political history where we see bipartisan convergence on almost any issue, but as I think becomes clear in interesting ways, there's a high level of certain consensus about the challenge from China. We're arguing about what to do about it, but there is, I think, a view of what the threat is, what the challenge is that is quite different from what it might have been 10 years ago. How would you describe that consensus? And to the extent that there is a kind of new paradigm in U.S. foreign policy, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think there is a new consensus. I think most Americans agree, and also a lot of national security practitioners or former practitioners would agree that Beijing is posing a severe challenge to American national security and prosperity, and even to our democracy increasingly. If you look at the interview, I think it was in April, that Secretary of State Tony Blinken gave an interview to CNN where he said Beijing is now crossing a threshold into what looks to be real interference in our democracy. And I don't think there are too many holdouts left that don't think that Beijing isn't the greatest national security challenge we face. In part, it's because Beijing is now so closely tied to the other adversaries that are challenging the US and our allies: Russia, Iran, Iran's proxies like Hamas. Beijing hosted a high-level delegation from the terrorist group Hamas on the same day in April that Secretary of State Tony Blinken was in Beijing. They didn't bother to inform him that their next meetings were going to be with Hamas after he was about to leave town. So there is, as you put it, an agreement on the existence of a threat. There is less agreement on the precise nature and modalities, and still less agreement on what we should do about it. But the first step has been achieved, and that's a remarkable achievement. I credit President Trump and his administration for really leading that shift, but I also credit President Biden and his team for embracing that consensus and sustaining several aspects of the Trump administration policy, and in some cases improving upon it, particularly when it comes to export controls on Beijing's high technology.
So in the essay, you get into some of those continuities, also some of the divergences where you see differences or tensions between either your preferred approach or the Trump approach and what Biden has done. And I'd say, one of the core critiques that you make is about this idea of quote unquote managing the competition. The kind of overarching idea of the piece is that, as you and Mike Gallagher put it, quoting you here, the United States shouldn't manage competition with China, it should win it. When you look at that question of management, I think there are a number of responses you can make to it. I think some of the Biden administration voices would point to, fentanyl talks or AI talks as something the U.S. has gotten out of that. But I think there are two that come through most clearly. The first one is about this idea of buying us time. Resh Doshi made this point in his response to you and Mike. He says that your approach, quoting him here, risks runaway escalation and could force a moment of reckoning before the United States has taken the very steps the authors recommend to strengthen its defense industrial base and improve its competitive position. I think, Neil Ferguson, who's written about détente and Kissinger and is not a is generally considered a hardliner on these questions, also says about détente that this is a way of tactically stalling in order to shore up our position. It's not a kind of permanent state. Do you see anything to that buying time argument and engaging in diplomacy as a means of giving the U.S. space and time to develop the tools it needs?
Yeah, I appreciated Rush Doshi's critique of our piece. I think it was the most substantive of the critiques that I've read in various places so far. I would remark before I talk about that idea of buying time and managing competition, I would remind listeners that Mike Gallagher and I, in our piece, spent quite a lot of time talking about things that we think President Biden's policy is doing well. Now, the problem that Mike and I point out that you've just teed up is that we don't think that aiming as, in essence, at the end state of managing competition is a sufficient or wise policy that has a good chance of succeeding. We think that you have to aim at victory, just like Beijing is aiming at victory. As Mike and I write, Xi Jinping is not aiming for a stalemate. He's aiming for something much more than that. And we need to do the same. But part of competing to win involves elements of management. We're not saying that we don't try to maintain high channels of communication with Beijing. We've been explicit ever since I was in office, and even through that piece, we're strongly in favor of the idea of the President of the United States maintaining a frequent, open channel of communication with Xi Jinping. We think, in fact, it's the only channel that really matters, because anything below the level of Xi Jinping is mostly on transmit and not on receive. The Chinese Communist Party officials who show up are under immense pressure to make points, and they are also don't have much of an audience at the top of the Chinese government to listen to and transmit our points. So the only way to really get a reliable message transmitted to Xi Jinping is to talk to Xi Jinping. So this idea of buying time, if we go back and we look at the US policy during the 1970s, where there was a similar rationale that was operating. Remember, we had just suffered a defeat in Vietnam. You had the Watergate scandal was playing out. The US public opinion was very much divided. You had the culture wars, you had anti-war protests, you had all the stuff from the 60s that tumbled into the 70s and really were demoralizing a big part of the American body politic. There was this thought that we should probably tone down our competitive instincts with this vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in order to buy time, lick our wounds, sort of figure things out. But what really took shape was something that did not allow us to buy time and gather strength, but in fact put us in a relatively worse position over the course of the 1970s as the Nixon administration came to an end and President Ford took office and then Jimmy Carter took office. You had three administrations pursuing détente, and the U.S. position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union grew worse, not better, over the course of that period of time. The Soviet economy strengthened as the Soviets made the most of tying Europe to greater dependency on exports of oil and other energy from the Soviet Union. The Soviets began to muck around in Africa, several parts of Africa, as well as in the Caribbean and in Central and South America. They began to muck around in the politics of course, Afghanistan and Central Asia, and eventually just launched an all-out invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. They were playing in Portugal. They were starting to play around in the politics of Europe and Western Europe. So by the end of this decade, Zbigniew Brzezinski really was the one who began to question whether détente itself might be the problem, that the very nature of détente itself was inviting aggression from our adversaries, opposed to carving out new areas of cooperation. So by the end of it, Zbigniew Brzezinski really persuaded President Carter to pivot in the final year of the Carter administration to a more hard-nosed, hard-line policy against the Soviets that I think was exactly right. I think they learned from the mistakes. Carter ended up losing that election. Ronald Reagan came in. Everyone was fearful of Reagan. People thought that he was a lightweight or that he just was going to be a little bit crazy. He ended up being perhaps the most successful U.S. president of the Cold War era in synthesizing all of the lessons learned from all of our mistakes and all of our successes in the previous decades, going all the way back to George Kennan at the very outset of the Cold War. And most of the critiques of us have not contested nor addressed the fact that the Reagan administration was the most successful Cold War strategy, as proven by the fact that he brought it to a peaceful ending. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, brought it to a landing just a couple of years after President Reagan left office.
So there's another, I think, smart rejoinder to the idea that we should have a kind of more openly risk-tolerant approach towards China. And that's that it will cause panic among our allies, first of all, allies and partners. And then second, that it will alienate much of the developing world, the global south, where there is to some degree, a contest for influence between the US and China. And that, we need to be seen to be responsible and careful in order to, maintain all those, partnerships. Do you see any value to that, any tension there?
Let's start with the global south, because you just mentioned two important ideas, but they're actually not interlinked. The reason that the global south is flummoxed by the United States and disappointed in the United States is not because we're competing in this great power competition and contest with China. It's that we're not showing up. We're just not showing up. When I talk to African leaders, I talk to leaders in Latin America, Central Asia, and other parts, they just say, where are you guys? They're not saying, we're really worried about your competition with China. They'd be happy to play us off of one another, but they can't even do that because we don't show up. There's a lot more that we need to do in that respect. Now, when it comes to this idea of other allies, our democratic allies who are treaty allies of the United States in the NATO footprint of Europe and the Western Pacific, look, what I did when I was in office, even before I was Deputy National Security Advisor, I was the coordinator for our Asia policy as the Senior Director for Asia. I had someone on staff at all times whose primary job was to engage with our European allies. So even though I was responsible for Asia, we were doing a lot of work with the Europeans. A lot of that was quiet, was behind closed doors, but we were always keeping them well informed in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris, and London, and onwards. We were keeping them well informed about our thinking, our assessments, and the direction that our policy was going. None of them said, don't do that because we're not ready to do that. What they said was, well, keep us informed. We're interested in continuing to exchange our observations on this front. And over time, lo and behold, we found that the European Union adopted some of the rhetoric and some of the actions that both the Trump and then the Biden administration undertook. So it's not that the wrong way to think about it is we have to have a perfectly united consensus policy with all of our European allies before we can move forward with defending America's interests vis-a-vis China. That's not a good way to think about it. We need to actually step forward, step out and lead, and hope through good exchanges and information that many of our allies will follow us. And that is exactly what has happened. So I don't like the idea of us watering down our policy to match a less assertive standard that sometimes emerges from Brussels, say. I'd rather that we step forward and lead by example, ductus exemplo, which is, by the way, the Marine Corps motto at the officer candidate school is ductus exemplo. And then if you lead, people will follow. And that is actually what's happening.
I don't want to get into this question of whether Xi Jinping and other senior Chinese leaders would prefer a second Trump term or a second Biden or other Democrat term. We're having this conversation on a day when Biden is still the candidate, but there's lots of reporting and rumors about a possible change. So we'll see where that goes. But you do hear from Chinese officials and scholars this belief that if Trump does return, there will be certain risks that the Chinese government face, the CCP would face, but also that it would have some effect on the alliances and partnerships that, have been one of the great successes of the Biden foreign policy. They say, look, we're in a world of blocks. Our block doesn't look that great if it's, Russia, China, North Korea against Japan and Australia and India and South Korea and the NATO allies. But they say, look, all those, that beautiful block of yours, that's going to come apart when Trump comes back, just given, everything he says about Article 5 in NATO and threatening to withdraw troops from South Korea and slapping tariffs on, Japan or India. Do you see any risk of that?
So what I would say is, first of all, if the United States under any president begins to really turn its back on our allies, that would be a godsend for Xi Jinping and for his axis of chaos. Vladimir Putin, the Ayatollah, little shrimps who are making noise now, the Castro remnant regime in Cuba and Maduro's regime in Venezuela and so on. Of course, let's not forget about Kim Jong-un. They would throw a pretty big wild party in celebration of the United States turning its back on NATO or even individual NATO allies, or turning its back on South Korea and so forth. No question about that. No question. But if we look at the first term of President Trump, what did he actually do, right? There was a lot of hand-wringing and concern that he was going to abandon allies. By the end of that term, I would argue our relationship with Korea, Australia, and Japan was stronger than what we had inherited. The press never likes to talk about how deeply disconcerted the Japanese government was with the Obama administration, or even Taiwan's government. We had much better relations and much more productive working ties with Taiwan under Trump than we had under Obama, according to all of the foreign leaders, or several that I've talked to in several countries in the Western Pacific. So it's important to remember that actually ties strengthened. With respect to NATO, there was a real threat made by President Trump to say, look, if you're not going to pay your way, you're on your own. By the end of the administration, I think Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, summed it up best. He said President Trump turned out to be the best dues collector in NATO history. There was a cumulative increase of hundreds of billions of dollars of spending by the European NATO allies. And now the majority of NATO allies actually have met the 2% of GDP spending threshold. 2% of their GDP they now spend on defense. And Europe as a whole, aggregately, has also met the 2% threshold, according to, I think, the most recent support coming out of the NATO Secretary General's office. That's a great tribute to President Trump's time in office. Now, what does that mean about a second term? I think it's absolutely crucial that President Trump, even as he shows some tough love to our allies to get them to step up in ways that will make us all safer, it's really important that the pressure that he applies be applied in ways that don't threaten the existence of those alliances. And I think there are ways to do that. You can actually find ways, maybe even to tariff countries that aren't meeting their obligation in defense spending, so that the U.S. recoups some of the money that we're spending on their behalf. But you can do that without threatening the very existence of the alliance. And I'm very hopeful if President Trump wins, I'm hoping that that's where he comes out. That's where he came out the first term. Certainly the people that I think he still trusts and talks to, who might be part of the second Trump term, are not looking to dismantle NATO. They're looking to strengthen it.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess that the person who deserves most credit for European defense spending going up is Vladimir Putin, not President Trump or President Biden for that matter. But
you can make the same argument that Japan's defense spending, which is in the process of doubling right now, owes much to the man in Beijing who serves as the current dictator there.
So I want to go to the second big plank of the argument in the essay. The first part of it is this notion that we need to accept more friction. The second is clarity of goal, what we're trying to achieve in competition with China. And I think in some ways this has been, in some ways the most useful part of the debate that has been sparked by the essay. You argue that we should have a clear objective of changing the nature of government in China. You're very careful to say this is not about an Iraq-style regime change, but you do say, in answer to the question, what would winning look like, quoting you and Mike here, China's communist rulers would give up trying to prevail in a hot or cold conflict with the United States, and the Chinese people, from ruling elites to everyday citizens, would find inspiration to explore new models of development and governance that don't rely on repression at home and compulsive hostility abroad.
That sentence that's the money quote of sort of what we envision as the end state. Now, it's important that what we said was that Chinese people themselves, including ruling elites, find inspiration to pursue or experiment with models that are not compulsively hostile to the United States and Chinese neighbors and others. I don't believe that should be as controversial as some have interpreted it to be. What we're saying is we're rooting for the Chinese people to find a better model that serves them a lot better, a less repressive model, and one that also doesn't result in, mass death happening outside of China's borders through their mismanagement of emergent diseases and their dangerous experiments with dangerous pathogens, or through their state-subsidized trade in fentanyl, illicit fentanyl.
Fentanyl precursors, right? Just to be precise about it, or
well, so if you look at the supply chain for illicit fentanyl, we're not talking about the stuff that they give you when you're getting surgery in a hospital, that like the legal small doses of medical grade fentanyl. I'm talking about the stuff that's killing upwards of 80,000 Americans a year and utterly destroying and melting the fabric of communities all across this country. China was selling that stuff direct into the United States, and these were Chinese state-owned enterprises. They were sending it by mail. They were intentionally mislabeling the mail. And during the Trump administration, President Trump was able to persuade Xi Jinping to classify those drugs in a category that required far greater strictures so that this stuff couldn't just be sent directly to us. What the Chinese Communist Party pivoted to do was have all the companies that were creating the fentanyl continue producing and exporting the chemicals, the precursor chemicals that make it, but send it straight to the drug cartels in Mexico. And not only are their customers illicit cartels, but Beijing, according to Congress, a bipartisan report that came out earlier this year from Congress, Beijing continues to provide state subsidies for those businesses to continue producing and exporting all of that junk that gets turned into the synthesized poison that continues to kill us by the tens of thousands each year. Now, what has also now come out is greater information about the role of China in the money laundering. In fact, the vast majority now of the money laundering on behalf of the cartels, so when they sell their stuff, their poison on American streets, they don't rely on their own networks now to repatriate the profits from the drug trade. They rely on Chinese money laundering networks. Those networks are not going to be able to operate without Beijing at least winking an eye, if not doing more than merely winking an eye. Even if Beijing is not the one dealing the stuff on our streets, they're providing state subsidies for all of the stuff that gets sold to the cartels to get turned into the fentanyl to kill us. And then the money round trips its way back to the cartels via Chinese illicit money laundering networks.
Let me ask two questions about that end state. I think the kind of, what the ideal outcome is clear. What is the theory of success? When you talk about, you kind of using American tools and accepting some risk to help bring that about, what are we able to influence? What's the kind of theory of the case here?
Yeah, the reason that Marxist-Leninist regimes are compulsively hostile is that they don't have a very compelling model on their own in and of themselves. Most Chinese people are not communists. There's probably 95 million members of the Chinese Communist Party out of 1.3 or now, less than 1.3 billion Chinese people. Their population is rapidly shrinking. The vast majority of Chinese people not only don't belong to the Chinese Communist Party, but they don't believe in communism. And so the whole edifice supporting this idea of Marxist-Leninist single-party dictatorship that doesn't respect rule of law, that impinges on people's rights and freedoms routinely in ways that people in China don't like. The substitute for this threadbare ideology now is we're going to make China great by basically building a regional and then global empire. And then we'll be rich and strong. And so, fu qiang, that's the Chinese phrase, rich and strong, rich and strong. And the Chinese Communist Party is the ones that are to get you there. The way that they're trying to make China rich is really at the expense of law-abiding free market economies, as well as poorer developing countries around the world. And so if they are not able to grow through those means, it stands to reason. It's merely an observation. It's not a call on my part for the United States to do something that compels regime change. Mike and I, in that sentence you just read, we're really making the same observation that George Kennan made all the way back when he wrote his article for Foreign Affairs magazine, which was that a Leninist system that is unable to achieve its global vision through hostile means ultimately will start to sag and then possibly collapse under its own rotten weight. That is what we just were describing. And what we're saying is we shouldn't be fearful of that. In fact, what we should really be looking to shape is the aftermath of the Chinese Communist Party so that we give China its best chance at becoming its best self on behalf of the Chinese people. it's not a call for us to try to subvert. We said explicitly, we're not calling for regime change and subversion here. What we're saying is we should not fear the outcome that is predicted by history, was predicted by George Kennan, that actually unfolded in the wake of Ronald Reagan's successful policy. So I don't think that should be something that is controversial or that should be called reckless and dangerous, like one commentator called our piece.
Is there any end state that you would find acceptable or that would allow some kind of accommodation that would still have the Chinese Communist Party in power?
If the Chinese Communist Party were not trying to poison 80,000+ Americans to death a year, if the Chinese Communist Party were not stealing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of American intellectual property each year, if the Chinese Communist Party were not actually the main backers of proxy wars against Europe and against countries in the Middle East via their proxies, Russia and Iran, I would revert back to the policy that I first advocated for when I was preparing to come into office, which was something more like this idea of a coexistence and trying to find a balance and try to say, look, we're not trying to fundamentally change you, but by the same token, you better not be directly harming our prosperity, national security, and public health and the rest. The problem is I've since graduated from that hopeful vision through experience. When the facts change, so does my opinion. So I just don't think that we are up to date with the reality of how deeply antagonistic Xi Jinping's vision and goals and actions are now. And that's why I wrote the piece for you together with Matthew Johnson and David Feith back in late 2022 called Xi Jinping in His Own Words, where we visited some of the things that Xi Jinping was saying, not when he was talking to the public audiences at Davos or standing in the Rose Garden. It was what Xi Jinping was saying in secret speeches to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, which we were eventually able to get a hold of those speeches months or years after they were delivered. That was the real guidance that Xi Jinping was giving, and it was inherently hostile to anything like a modus vivendi or coexistence. There's no trace of coexistence in the internal speeches as an end state for Xi Jinping. He's going for the whole loaf of bread. He's not looking to split it.
We'll be back after a short break. And now back to my conversation with Matt Pottinger. I mean, there's a lot of commentary that focuses on Xi Jinping's role and, everything that is particular about him that makes coexistence difficult. But your journey, you don't need to go back into your life story in great detail, but my sense of your radicalization on this issue, if you could put it that way, started long before Xi Jinping was in power, when you were a Wall Street Journal reporter in China in the 90s and aughts, where you started to see some of the elements of what we're seeing now. I mean, is everything really going to go back to the kind of Deng Xiaoping era accommodation even after Xi Jinping?
Look, one of the things Mike wrote, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was later in the article. What we said was Xi Jinping, who is committing genocide, according to Tony Blinken and Mike Pompeo, they agree on that much, that China's committing genocide against some of its own people. It's waging these proxy wars. It's doing all these things. It is unrealistic to think that a dictator who's doing all of those things right now is going to be a reliable partner that we can solve global problems with. I think that is pure fantasy. I even think that is irresponsible and dangerous, to make that kind of an assumption. But I think we said something to the effect in the article also that we need to wait until China produces a leader that we can do business with, right? And we didn't define that it has to be a democratically elected leader. What we said was that the People's Republic of China, as practiced by a single-party dictatorship under Xi Jinping right now, is compulsively hostile, is rapidly undermining our interests, including here at home with information warfare, efforts to interfere in our elections, and so on. So let's not make life easier for Xi Jinping. Let's not give him the means to expand the sources of his belligerence, which are his economic power and his access to high technology. Imagine if, for a moment, Vladimir Putin had a $17 trillion economy like China purportedly does, rather than merely a $2 trillion economy that Russia reportedly has today. Think of how immense the damage would be beyond the damage that Putin is already doing if he had a $17 trillion economy at his back. I'm glad Putin only has a $2 trillion economy, and I'd like to make that economy a lot smaller than $2 trillion now in light of what he's doing. The same is true of China. I don't wish Chinese people ill, and in fact, Chinese people are voting with their feet. Anyone who can, irrespective of their social strata, is trying to flee China right now, many of them successfully, a lot of them to come to the United States, okay? So it's not that I mean the Chinese people harm. I do mean to deprive Xi Jinping of the sources of his aggression. And one of them is high technology that can be weaponized, and the other is just sheer economic power that he can use to fund his what is already the largest military buildup since the Nazis.
Let's talk about what has historically been one of the thorniest issues in the U.S.-China relationship, and today is probably one of the biggest flashpoints, and that's Taiwan. You, of course, have a new book about Taiwan. You wrote a piece with Andrew Erickson and Gabe Collins, drawing from that book in Foreign Affairs a few months ago. You have, I think, been fairly clear that you would embrace a policy of what's called strategic clarity. I mean, being explicit about our willingness to step in and use U.S. force if Beijing tries to take Taiwan by force. Joe Biden has said that I believe 4 times. Unclear exactly what that means about the policy, but he's certainly gone farther than any president before us, and that includes Trump, who I think even recently has said that he would not say anything clear about it, would maintain his version of ambiguity.
President Trump's statements are in tune with the 40 years of American strategic ambiguity. Biden's are much closer to something like strategic clarity, given that, at least according to the Constitution, Biden and not his staff are the ones who actually make policy. And so I take President Biden at his word when he says 4 times that he would come to Taiwan's defense if China were to attack. I think that future presidents and future candidates for president probably shouldn't back away from that new line that's been drawn. That said, I don't spend a lot of time on the debate between ambiguity and clarity because I think it is a sideshow relative to the question of, do we have credible capability to back up anything we say with respect to Taiwan? And that's the first cornerstone for effective deterrence, much more than anything we say rhetorically.
The more complicated or an equally complicated dimension of this problem is, scenario short of that full-scale invasion that people worry about. And that's much closer to what we're seeing now, both around Taiwan and also in the South China Sea. People call this gray zone tactics or salami slicing. You can kind of characterize it in different ways, but it's in some ways hard to imagine the U.S. going to war with China over an old, World War II era boat that's stuck on a reef in the South China Sea that the Philippines controls, or, because a Chinese Coast Guard ship has gotten, a little bit too close to Taiwan shore. I mean, the South China Sea might be the most useful place to play this out, given how urgent it is.
I mean, the reason that Beijing has picked a completely and almost irrelevant speck on the map to start waging gray zone pressure is precisely because they know that we are psychologically inhibited from viewing that speck on the map as strategically important or these tactics as a military attack. And so Beijing is trying to come in just under the threshold of what it would take to actually awaken an American response. Why are they doing that? They want to show the world, they want to show the Philippine people, followed by the people of Taiwan, that resistance is futile, that you cannot actually win because the United States isn't going to be there for you, just like they're not there for Second Thomas Shoal, where a squad of Philippine Marines are bravely guarding the sovereignty of the Philippine nation. So I think we need to start getting a lot more serious in terms of imposing costs on Beijing for the actions it's already undertaking.
If you were in your old job of Deputy National Security Advisor and you were, tasked with delivering a message to a Chinese counterpart about what the consequence of another incident like the one that we just saw at Second Thomas Shoal,
I would speak with actions rather than merely words. And I would start making it easy for them to spot things that have just made the bar that much higher for them to succeed in bullying the Philippines or in trying to assert jurisdiction over Taiwan's near waters.
What might something like that be? I mean, we don't need a full set of options, but
well, I'll throw some ideas out there. I mean, for one, if President Marcos were to request the help, I would advise the president to start providing a helicopter airlift to Philippine troops on those offshore outposts close to the Philippines that are administered by the Philippines, but which are now being threatened by China. I would help them do that. I would start inviting Japan to get more directly involved. Japan has a very capable Coast Guard. Why not start putting some Japanese Coast Guard cutters forward to the Philippines and more Coast Guard cutters into the Western Pacific? I would certainly be trying, as I tried to do when I was in office, to significantly beef up the United States Coast Guard, to give it more of a budget rather than having them, just be a hand-me-down sort of budget from portions of the U.S. Navy budget. The Coast Guard is awesome, and it is our own gray zone tool. So let's beef that way the heck up. If that means that we have to buy or lease some ships because America's own shipbuilding capacity has fallen into disarray, the Europeans as well as the South Koreans and the Japanese are great at making ships. Combined, they make almost as many ships as China. Let's start leasing ships from our friends and allies. It's probably going to be cheaper, frankly, than us building our own in some cases.
Some of your former colleagues in the Trump administration have been critical of U.S. support for Ukraine on the argument that it distracts us from deterring China in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific, that we should really kind of focus resources there, and that Ukraine is a kind of, black hole of resources and strategic focus that we need to walk away from. I mean, Trump himself has not been exactly, when given the opportunity to declare coming to Ukraine, he's evaded it. And, J.D. Vance and others, but a possible vice presidential pick, have been even sharper about the need to step away from Ukraine. How do you see that connection?
Yeah, but my view is you need a bigger pie instead of trying to slice the pie differently. I agree with those views that we need to do much more to give Beijing something to think about in order to deter Xi Jinping from taking actions against Taiwan. That means more money than was made available for that theater in the last important supplemental. What I would not argue for is us turning our back on Ukraine and pretending that it'll all work out and that Europe will, without American leadership, step up. The Europeans are doing more and more all the time. They need to do much more still. That's going to require American leadership, not American abandonment. If Ukraine falls, has anyone really done a careful analysis of what would be required in new manpower, new European spending, new U.S. spending in order to defend now the NATO line, which is going to be right up against Russian-occupied Ukraine? That's going to be multiples of what we're spending to keep Ukrainians fighting bravely and to ensure that Russia at least doesn't gain more ground than it's already taken. So this is it's prudent. It's not ideological. It's not romantic. This is just practical. We're going to end up spending a hell of a lot more money if Ukraine falls than we're spending right now to keep them in the fight.
And Xi Jinping would presumably see that as an encouraging sign.
No doubt. But for those who say, therefore, we shouldn't, that who cares what Xi Jinping thinks? That's not what this is about. My counter argument to that is, think about what we would have to spend if Ukraine falls. Put Xi Jinping aside for a minute. What would we have to spend just to ensure that NATO does not end up getting probed and attacked? It's going to be multiples of what we're spending right now. So we're being penny wise, pound foolish when we argue, Ukraine's not really a valid place for us to be helping right now.
Speaking of kind of Xi Jinping perception, turning that back on the United States, when you were in office, you resigned on January 6th, given the events at the Capitol. I don't imagine that was primarily because of what it meant for the U.S.-China relationship, but surely China watches that kind of event and senses a, distracted adversary. Any kind of disruption democratic process this year would send a similar signal.
China made hay of January 6th. Their propagandists did. They're trying to make hay of President Biden's disconcerting performance in his debate. And, we need to do better, on both fronts. But what I'll say is the United States has the ability. We often don't do it until we've exhausted every other option, but we have the ability to course correct and to regenerate and to refresh and renew and to do so in ways short of revolution, right? If any system can do it, it's ours. That's why our system's so worth preserving. So I would say, enjoy the laughter while you can get it, Beijing and Moscow. We'll see who wins the marathon.
Let me ask one final question that is similarly forward-looking, along the lines of that Churchillian note. Without presuming anything, if there is a second Trump term come 2025, what do you think the next big strategic moves on China should be?
If you look at United Front messaging and Chinese diplomacy, the thing that it prizes more than anything else, the thing that it wants to preserve in its bilateral relationship with the United States above all else, is access to our technology in our laboratories. That's number one. I would start taking a much harder look at that. That doesn't mean a wholesale decoupling, but what it means is making it a lot harder for people to gain access to labs when we have a reasonable suspicion that those people are really there to bring that technology back home to serve Beijing's military buildup and the weaponization of technology on behalf of the Chinese security services. We can do a lot better than we're doing on that front and still preserve people-to-people ties, still have, Chinese immigrants and also Chinese students come study in the United States, but we need to be much more hardline about it. So number two is just the deterrence piece, right? Making sure that we've got a military that's up to the task of credibly being ready and able to defeat our foes so that we won't have to fight and defeat our foes. The trade element, which President Trump has been most vocal about, is also critical. And I'm glad that President Biden increased tariffs on certain areas. I think President Trump, if he's elected, would go farther and faster. I don't want to see just a 200% tariff on Chinese EVs. I want to see an outright ban on Chinese EVs, including the building of Chinese EVs in the United States, because it's still the Chinese supply chain, and that's a national security threat to the United States. So we should not be allowing China to export its excess capacity and production in order to wipe out our manufacturing industry and make China richer so that it can do its worst.
欢迎来到六度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，六度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事。通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。
想成为全球沟通达人吗？六度人工智能语音克隆技术帮你实现梦想。在这个新时代，语言障碍已成过去。我们隆重推出六度人工智能语音克隆系统，这项由欧美亚顶尖专家研发的突破性技术，让你可以克隆自己的声音，并将文字转换成145种语言和方言，提升你的个人和职业生活。想象一下，你可以在日本参加商务会议，在巴西上课，或与意大利的朋友畅聊，而这一切都用你自己的声音、他们的语言进行。操作简单，只需点击几下，无需复杂的科技知识，就能享受无缝衔接的体验，让世界向你敞开。从商务到教育，从媒体到娱乐， 应用场景无处不在。企业可以更好地与全球客户建立联系，教育机构可以提供多语言学习，媒体可以创作更丰富的内容，触达更广泛的受众。今天就来体验这项革命性技术吧。访问：迈向你的声音无国界的未来。
欢迎来到六度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，六度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。